All right, welcome back to our second day of the Dev 401 training. What we're going to do today is we're going to focus on designing apps for multiple users, which is to say we're going to talk about different security and access control functionality, okay? But before we get into that, I wanted to do a couple of things. One, I wanted to do kind of a review of what we covered yesterday, and then there's a few outstanding questions that I wanted to address. Did a little research last night. Okay. All right, so let's start off with a review of what we did yesterday, and I'll just open this up to let anyone kind of jump in with any sort of answer, but can people tell me about what we did yesterday with respect to the data model? So anyone want to volunteer for what we created yesterday that would fall under the umbrella of the data model?
Created objects.
Okay, Anu? Yeah, go ahead.
We created objects.
Created objects, fields. Very good. Yeah, using the fields, we define relationships. Very good. So the key to our data model is that we have objects. The objects are similar to tables, and then our fields are like columns. And then instead of having rows or instead of thinking in terms of rows, we think in terms of records. So that's the terminology that we use, but they're roughly aligned to those relational database terms. And then relationships. So there were two primary types of relationships that we defined yesterday. Who'd like to volunteer the two types of relationships? Chris, here we go. Lookup relationships are one-to-many. All relationships are, yeah? Master detail. So the two types were lookup and master detail. One was loosely coupled, so our lookup relationships are loosely coupled and our master detail are tightly coupled. Now both of them are one-to-many. So both of them have the same characteristic of a child references a single parent, but a parent can reference many children, okay, or have many related children, okay? And then what about user interface? So what kind of user interface stuff did we create yesterday? Very good. Page layouts, tabs, apps. Very good. Okay. Very good. So the three main things that we worked on were applications, tabs, and then page layouts. Our applications, really simply a collection of tabs. A tab is normally associated with a specific type of object, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. We can create tabs which display visual force pages, and we can create tabs which, for instance, incorporate either internet or intranet applications. And then our page layouts were the default view for displaying information associated with our custom and standard objects. Okay. And then in the afternoon, we did business logic stuff. So what were some of the business logic features that we implemented? Workflow rules, very good. Validation rules, very good. I knew you're on a roll. What else? Formula fields, very good. So workflow, validation, formula fields. Roll-up summary, yeah. So roll-up summary fields, so let's kind of recap some of these things. So the workflow rule allowed us to do some automation in the sense that something happened and then we did something else. Okay, so if a record met our criteria, let's then perform some action. Our validation rule had to do with data quality and making sure that when data was being entered into the database that it met our requirements. We would code a formula which would evaluate the data it would return either true or false, so there'd be some sort of call to a function or some sort of test of equivalence, or measure greater than or whatever. We could create larger conditions in the sense that we could use conditional logic like ands and ors, right? And then ultimately, if it returned, if we discovered an error, then we would display an error message to the end user, and then we would prevent the write of the record to the database. So it's a mechanism by which we can prevent bad data going in. And then does anyone remember, in terms of coding our our formula, if it discovers an error, should our formula return true or false? True, yeah. So the error condition is true. Okay. So that's the workflow and the validation rules. And then we also created a formula field. So our formula field was able to perform a calculation or to do cross-object references. So we're able to go up to parents, grandparents, and be able to pull down data for the purpose of displaying it on child records. We could also utilize that, for instance, in things like reports, in the sense that we might want to, group reviews by candidate or something like that, utilize something along those lines. And then our roll-up summary fields, the roll-up summary fields allowed us to perform an aggregate calculation on the children associated with a specific record. And then what type of relationship was that required to be? Master detail relationship, exactly. Roll-up summary fields are not available in lookups. They're only available within a master detail relationship. Okay. All right. So any questions before we move on? No? Okay. All right. All right, so the second thing that I wanted to do this morning is I did a little research on some of these questions that I wasn't able to answer yesterday. And so one of the questions was the number of tabs per application. I couldn't find a tab per app limit. The limit I found was associated with the license type. So Professional Edition is 10 custom tabs. Enterprise Edition is 25 custom tabs. And then Unlimited Edition, there's an unlimited number of tabs that you can have. Like I said, I couldn't find a per app limit associated with that. Now, after you have about 10 tabs, though, assuming that they're 1 to 2 words on average, it starts to get ugly. So there's more of a functional limit, I would say, in the sense that, when you start to get, in my case, one of the things that, here, this isn't too bad, but notice that, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I have 12, and it's taking up all my real estate. So once you start to get to a higher number, unfortunately, there's no sort of, I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's sort of multiple levels of tabs. It's just one layer of tabs. And so you kind of hit a, to me, it's more of a design thing as opposed to a design limit as opposed to a hard limit, at least in terms of what I could find. And I've done more than this. In fact, I cleaned it up and I moved a bunch of stuff down to an application called Custom Administration, which you guys will create. But just to move some stuff so it's a little bit cleaner. All right. So another question that came up, when performing an upsert, can multiple external ID fields be used? Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here because one of the things that we'll talk about on Thursday morning is upserts and external IDs. We talked about it yesterday because it's one of the options associated with our fields. But out on the discussion boards, Simon Fell, who's one of our lead developers, in fact, he has a website and he blogs and all that kind of stuff. And he posted a comment, and he said, Upstart can only be used in Upstart can only use a single external ID field. If you're using a compound key, then you'll need to store the compound version in its own field. Like I said, Simon is one of the principal developers, so I'm taking his word as law. So, and then in the translation workbench, can certain users be constrained to certain languages? So what I did was I found the language field is a setting in personal information. And so if I click on edit for my user account, down here at the bottom is where I can set what my user or what my language would be. Now this is something that's under personal information, and every user has access to personal information. I can't figure out how to turn off access to this. I tried logging in just to test this out as a different user. One of the things that we can do in Salesforce when we're sysadmins is we can log in as another user to test out what that user is capable of doing. And for instance here, notice that when logging in as a user with a non-sysadmin profile, we'll talk about profiles in a second, notice that my setup menu is severely constrained because that's what this profile does, is it's not a sysadmin profile. And yet, I can still come down here and set and modify the language. So it's not, you can't as far as I can tell, to the best, and I searched on the forums and all that, as far as I can tell, it's not something that you can lock down. A user can update their language. So it's a user setting.
But the translation workbench is for the purpose of putting your own translations in for these language sets?
Exactly. So the translation workbench there's more to show you where you can get more information. We don't really cover the translation workbench here in the developer class, but let me show you where you can get more information. So in the user's guide, which by the way, if you want to download the PDF version of the user's guide, go into Help and Training, and then if you click on Help, here you can download the PDF version of the user guide. The PDF version of the user guide is just the HTML help in PDF format. So the content is the same. So you can use help or you can download the PDF. I prefer to use the PDF myself. So that's where you can get that. But in the user guide, it does talk about, let me see if I can find translation workbench. Let's do let's see here. Setting up the translation workbench, and then so what you ultimately do here is there's a lot of stuff that you as a developer could create that could have translated terminology. So field labels is the simplest one. So in our case, we have field labels that we've created in English because that's the only thing that our orgs are enabled for. But there's a whole slew of things that your users would need to, or that you would develop that are user-facing that your users would want translated versions of. And so what the translation workbench allows you to do is to enable languages for your org, and then to create labels for all different types of purposes in other languages. So, okay. Is the name field, so another question was, is the name field indexed? I searched far and wide to try and find this out, and the best thing that I found was in the Web Services API guide. It says basically there's metadata associated with fields, and the Web Services API guide describes some of the field properties and how different fields behave differently. For instance, there are properties like, is it nillable? Is a field nillable in the sense that, can you set this equal to null? Is it even possible? So yesterday I mentioned that text fields cannot actually be null. What they do is they ultimately return an empty string. Okay, so it would not have that nillable property associated with it. So what I found was, so this ID lookup property can be used to specify a record in an upsert call. And it said that this had to do with performance and indexing, and it says the ID field of this object has this property and some name fields. So it looks like the name, whether or not this is indexed, seems to be, in some cases yes, some cases no. But there doesn't seem to be a rule, as far as I can tell. Now this all being said, so I couldn't find a definitive answer on this one. This all being said, if you're running reports or you're running queries of some sort using, for instance, SOQL or whatever it may be, and you're experiencing poor performance, you can call support and they will work with you to identify why, if you're running a query or if you're running a report, why is this, having poor performance? And there are things that they can do to improve the performance. That's my recommendation with respect to that. If you do see the poor performance, call support, work with them to eliminate or to find a solution to that. Okay. So, all right. Any questions about anything that I've discussed so far this morning? Okay. And Leah, thanks for doing the research on the tabs. She located that one. So. All right, so let's jump into designing apps for multiple users. All right. Okay, so the topic today is really oriented towards security. Salesforce is inherently a multi-user application. Therefore, it has a large number of features associated with access to data. And we can, as you'll see, we can kind of slice it and dice it many different ways, and there's many different features that work in concert that would affect what your users are able to see and what they're able to do. Okay? All right, so let's jump into this. All right, so when you are thinking about security within a Salesforce application, or when you're thinking about multiple users interacting on the same data, you might want to identify who your actors are. We're using the term actors because roles have a meaning, but if it helps to think of this as being a role right now, think about the people who are participating in this application, what their responsibilities are, and what they're going to need to be able to see and do within those applications. So who are the stakeholders? Is there data that needs to be protected? So this is kind of flipping it from a user perspective to a data perspective. So from a data perspective, is there stuff that we need to lock down? Or conversely, is there data where we don't need to lock it down? Therefore, we can open up access to that data and not have to concern ourselves with the, quite frankly, the effort of protecting data. So when you open up the data, it's really easy to do. Everyone has access to it, but suddenly the amount of effort it takes is very simple because it's very easy to open up access. You don't have to worry about identifying which users can access it or not. How can we make the user experience more streamlined? And then also from an administrative standpoint, it's not just data-oriented, but also permissions in the sense that will all users be able to create their own reports and run reports? So can they customize reports? Can they view the setup menu and see the configuration? So not just a data-oriented view, but also well, what can you do from a Salesforce standpoint in terms of permissions, in terms of using different functionality? Our different features that we have that we'll be talking about today sort of address each of these different areas associated with multiple users. All right, so let's talk about one of the things that we're going to do today is that we're going to be heavily oriented towards creating some requirements in our universal containers organization, or creating some within our recruiting app, having some business requirements, and then fulfilling those business requirements with the different things that are available to us. There are certain actors that exist within universal containers when we're talking about the recruiting application. Those are recruiters, hiring managers, and interviewers. So each of these people play a specific role within our application. And they have different levels of access for different types of objects. So for instance here, recruiters need to be able to create, view, and modify positions, candidates, job applications, and reviews. It says recruiters, all of our actors should not have the ability to delete any records in our recruiting application. And then there's some sort of conditional logic where we have this, hiring managers should be able to create new positions and view and update all fields where they are the hiring managers. So we have a requirement that isn't simply sort of a global universal requirement. There's actually a condition to this. So it's not something we could just universally apply for all hiring managers. It's are you the hiring manager, not just are you a hiring manager. And then our interviewers, different things that they should be able to do with positions and candidates. We're going to restrict access to certain information associated with our candidates. Okay, and we're going to utilize a number of different features in order to fulfill those requirements. So we'll come back to those. Don't worry about the fact that we just showed 2 slides worth of requirements to you, and you're probably, they're already sort of out of sight, out of mind. We'll be breaking down each of those individual requirements as we go through the day. So we'll come back to those. All right, what we've done here is we've created a matrix, and the purpose of this matrix is to identify the different actors within universal containers and the different things that they're going to be able to do with different types of objects. So our vertical axis are our recruiter, hiring manager, and interviewers, our different actors, and then the horizontal axis are different types of objects. Now, the RCE, what is that? Well, there are 4 different types of permissions associated with objects. And those are read, create, edit, and delete. Okay? Now, you see the R, the C, and the E for read, create, and edit, but you don't see the D for delete. And the reason is that we had a requirement previously that said none of these people should be able to delete records. Maybe we need to archive them for regulations or whatever it may be. So that's why we're not seeing those. But we've kind of mapped out the different objects and what the different actors will be able to do with those different objects. There's also some caveats here. It says where assigned for the hiring manager and the interviewer. And then also there's the double asterisk, which is only their own. One of the things that we'll get into is record ownership and how being the record owner grants you certain privileges versus there are different levels of access that can be shared with other users. Okay, so. So if there's not an asterisk, then it's kind of universal. But if there is an asterisk, then it's not universal. We need to use what will ultimately be a record level access in order to fulfill those requirements. So on a record by record basis. Okay? All right. So any questions about anything I've talked about kind of at that high level intro for what we're talking about today? Or for that matter, anything? Okay. All right, so who did I leave off on yesterday for our quiz questions? Me? It's my turn? I can do the first one. John, did you, you're the employee. You're the new guy. So what things should you consider before building an application? So with respect to our designing apps for multiple users, what were some of those things?
Well, you need to decide, the end users are actors,
Uh-huh.
the term we're using class, what access they should have to which objects, what data they'll be manipulating, and to what extent they'll be manipulating that data, whether it be creating the data or simply reading it,
Yeah.
updating it, or deleting it.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So mapping out who the players are, what they're going to do, and then in addition, we can also flip it, look at things from a data standpoint. Is there sensitive data? Do we need to apply some rules that essentially restrict data? And then are there exceptions? And so we'll get into sort of record level rules. So on a record by record basis, we implement different levels of access dependent upon the data. Okay. Kevin, who are the actors in the recruiting application?
Yeah, for ours we have the recruiters, we have the hiring managers, and the interviewers.
Very good. So yes. So Chris, what are the objects that we will need to track?
Positions, reviews, job apps.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Candidates? Candidates, yeah. So very good. Reviews, job applications, candidates, positions, those are the main ones, but we'll be doing some stuff with some more. All right.
For more information on Salesforce.com training and certification, please visit www.salesforce.com/training.